Right. Okay. So a little bit of history here. In the long, dark days of COVID, I don't think I'd ever been so busy giving talks, including one to the Central London RSPB group. And quite a lot of RSPB groups are running Zoom lectures. I had great fun putting together some stuff for here and sharing it out. But the most challenging one was my own class in Bedford, where I ran weekly courses, and we couldn't go out bird watching. And I set a sort of challenge to people to come up with something about ask me questions about their favorite birds. And I tried to put a 10, 15-minute presentation together about them. And this went on and on over weeks and became called a potpourri of birds. And at the end of COVID, I'm left with a whole back catalogue of talks on a whole variety of different species. So your group organisers have chosen 7 for tonight. It's not primarily about birds in London, although I can sometimes put them into a London context. I was born and brought up in the west side of London near Feltham, so I did a lot of bird watching on the southwest side. So the 7 species we've chosen for tonight are Nuthatch, Kingfisher, Starling, your long-tailed tit. Just get rid of this screen. I've got your pictures appearing on front of my pictures. That's better. I can see. That's right. I can see my birds now. Redwing and red kite and fieldfare. Not necessarily in that order. Yes, Alison mentioned books. Yes, I've written a lot of books. This isn't a commercial for the books, but I will draw attention to 2 of them. The first one is the RSPB Handbook of British Birds, which has been out now for a good 20 years and on to its 5th edition. And I'm going to draw on that a little bit and show you the sort of data from those pages as an introduction to each of the species. That'll be self-explanatory as we go through it. And the other book, the RSPB Birds, A Hidden World, a lot of this stuff is in there in one form or another. Anyway, I want to start with Starling. Let's move on. Charismatic, very popular species. I think it's got more popular as it's got rarer, which is slightly sad, but I think true. This is the introduction from the RSPB handbook. And I just want to draw your attention to 1 or 2 facts that the Starling is a red data species now. And the other thing is that the oldest Starling ever recorded at the moment is 22 years old. So sometimes I love the longevity of birds. This isn't the average, as you see there. The average age, the mean is only 5 years, but at least one reached the magic age 22. And I'll share more of that information with you as we go along. Little known facts, obvious really, but amazing how many people perhaps don't notice the plumage differences of starlings. This is what often is called winter plumage. I prefer to correctly call it a non-breeding plumage, a bit more technical, and it's very spotty with a dark bill. If you look at a starling in summer, they haven't got so many spots and they have a bright yellow bill. And this is because those spots wear off as the winter goes on. They don't have melanin in those pale tips of their feathers. They break off, especially as the bird visits would-be nest sites and things, and reveals underneath the bright glossy plumage ready for spring. Very clever way of getting a different looking plumage without actually growing new feathers. So, and that's that's technically breeding plumage. And this is one I photographed in March. I'm trying to use my own photographs as much as possible. And this is an in-between one I photographed in Norfolk in March. And it is sort of half and half plumage. Hasn't got the full yellow bill, and it has still got a rather lot of spots. So that's a sort of transitional plumage. They have a juvenile plumage, of course, and this is a smoky grey brown, typical juvenile. And then one that confuses people a lot is the juveniles. Is a juvenile plumage sort of transition between a juvenile to adult, and looks very odd for a time. This one I photographed in Leicester Square. I remember taking the picture. If you listen to Starling, you can tell when they're singing, even if you can't hear them. This one is up on some wires quite high, but you can tell by the way the throat feathers are sticking out, the way it's thrown its head back, that is singing. And here it is closer to. And you might just be able to hear it. We just listen for a moment. So this one is mimicking. You may hear it. It does car alarms. It does chickens. And it does ducks, or chickens, probably chickens. Anyway, a great example of mimicry. Begs the question, why? Why do birds mimic? Individual recognition, possibly the mate of the pair might recognize her own individual because of his unique song. That may be important. It may be part of sexual selection. It may be the females prefer the males that are the best mimics because that shows that they're brighter, intelligent, or just more fit for life. It may confuse rivals as to they're not quite which bird is which. I'm never quite sure about that theory. Apparently, they can copy regional dialects of other starlings, and so that allows them to perhaps mix in other flocks they wouldn't otherwise mix with. And this is straight odd, but it's been on lyrebirds where different species altogether, but they found alarm calls made by the male during courtship cause the female to freeze and make the whole act of mating more successful. Now, I don't know if that applies to starlings, but I thought it was too good of a fact to leave out. As far as habitats, where do you find them? Well, anywhere almost. So obviously central London used to be famous for its starling roosts, and out into the wider countryside, there are starlings. And if you look at the atlas maps of Britain, they're very, very widespread indeed, apart from the highest mountain tops. But if you start to look at the atlas more in more detail and look where the birds are concentrated, Ireland has a lot, but there are large chunks of Britain where they're missing, and other places, and it's noticeable southeast and around London, where there's still fair concentrations. A lot of those are also around conurbations. The famous thing about starlings is the murmurations, the flocks that form in the evenings in certain parts of Britain in winter. Haven't got time to go that in too much detail, but what is interesting is that although there are a lot of British birds amongst those, a lot of them are actually migrants from elsewhere in Europe. And that made me go and look at the British Trust for Ornithology website to see where some of these starlings might be coming from. And here's a map by the BTO showing where starlings recorded in winter or recorded in Britain have actually appeared at other times. So you can see that the Holland, Belgium, Denmark, southern Scandinavia, lots have come from there. But look further east, the other side of the Baltic, right across the other side of the Baltic, right into Poland, and right into parts of Western Russia. Those starlings are regularly arriving in Britain in winter, increasing our winter populations. Looking at the world population, goes right across Europe, but for a large chunk of that salmony pink area, they're summer migrants. And so a lot have to move. That's why a lot come to Britain. And in some areas in Southern Europe, they're just winter migrants. That's the world population. But you may well know that there are many in America. And something I call cultural connections. I try to link birds with people whenever I can. One little story just to illustrate what happened there. 1890, Eugene Shevkin released 80 starlings into Central Park, New York. And now there are approximately 200 million starlings across North America. So scientists have looked closely at that introduction program. We wouldn't do it these days, but these sort of things happen and happened in the past and happen now inadvertently. And they called it the founder effect. Apparently those 80 starlings probably came from a similar genetic source. There was less genetic variation when they were released, and they were enormously successful in spreading out from New York and across the US. Just one point about feeding. They like feeding in flocks, and you can see why when you see this picture of a feeding starling when it's got its head down amongst the grass. It's very difficult for it to see would-be predators sneaking up on it. The safety of feeding in a flock becomes obvious when you see a picture like that. This picture I was pleased with because it actually shows what the starling does with its bill when it's trying to maneuver bits of grass and ferret between the roots of grass, because what it's looking for are invertebrates, things like leather jackets, which of course are the larvae of crane flies, one of the most common foods of starling and a good friend to the gardener for that. But of course, starlings have a reputation for being great scavengers, and I can't help thinking that we've done them a great disservice by being actually too tidy. And if you only think back not too many years when corporation tips weren't covered with soil as quickly as they are these days, they were covered in flocks of starlings. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing to have done, but in doing so, we probably deprived starlings of a whole food source they probably had previously. Anyway, that's probably enough on starling. I'm going to literally have to race through these species, but let's move on to another one of my personal favourites. So excited when I still remember seeing my first nuthatch, or hearing it actually before I saw it. Looking at the book, we've got a green species, so we don't have to worry too much. This seems to be doing okay. And a bird that can live up to, at the moment, the oldest bird recorded is 12 years old. You're probably familiar with nuthatch. I won't go through how you identify them, although I always like to describe the sort of bandit-like mask which they seem to wear, which seems to conceal the eye. I wonder how intentional that is. Is it so the eye doesn't stand out from the face? I don't know, but you wonder how that evolved. If you're lucky, they will come into gardens and feed on your feeders. I've never lived anywhere where that's happened, but lots of people are lucky enough to have that happen. Their food, very straightforward, but also interesting. Summer food, invertebrates, beetles, spiders, other invertebrates. But like so many of these small birds, their food preferences completely switches when you get to winter, because obviously those summer foods are not available. So autumn and winter food are much more likely to be seeds and nuts, acorns, hazel, pine, and yew. And when it comes to yew nuts, we're talking about yew seeds, which of course are highly toxic to a lot of animals. Yew is a funny bush. But nevertheless, nuthatches do seem to be unaffected by the toxin, or at least they crack open the little seed in the middle of the yewberry and take out the kernel inside that, which is edible. I know at the lodge, RSPB headquarters, I used to go around and find seeds of yews wedged in crevices in barks where nuthatches had hammered them open, which of course is what gives them their name of nuthatch, hatching nuts, opening nuts. And great fun showing children we took round where the nuthatches have been busy working, even if we actually didn't see the nuthatches very much. It also hides food. There are not many species in Britain that hide food systematically, but nuthatch is one of them. And there's one about to hide some food, perhaps. They're known for their unusual way of perching, that most birds perch across branches, and this one is perched across a branch, although it does look a bit odd in the process. Much more usual, perhaps, is seeing them crawling or walking, hopping along a branch, sort of parallel with it. That's a much more usual and comfortable looking nuthatch position. And the other one is, of course, the famous fact that they can run up and down trees. They're reputed to be, I'm sure it's right, the only species that are comfortable going down trees head first as well as going up. This was photographed at the lodge. And I've got a recording here. Let's just listen to this. I hope you'll hear it.
Nuthatch.
This brings back memories, because this was the call where I first saw and heard my nuthatch. I was in the Forest of Dean, and I heard that sound in spring and had no idea what it was. But I suppose I was in my late teens, and tracked it down and found what was for me at that time first nuthatch. I then went on to get very familiar with nuthatches, actually in London, or just about in London, Richmond Park. And many of you will know the Isabella plantations and places there where you can actually feed these birds and they become almost hand tame. And I was a regular there for, for many years. Distribution. Well, it misses out London. I'm sure Richmond Park is still there somewhere. But you can see there is quite a concentration in the south of Britain, south of England, really, and the west of Britain, including Wales, but very scarce in the east, and very scarce and non-existent once you go further up in Scotland, and like Westbody woodpecker, well, changing now, but not in Ireland. So many of our those sort of birds that don't move much, and it's highly sedentary species. It hasn't really made it to Ireland yet. One little known fact is the fact that it nests in it nests in holes in trees, but it often nests in holes that are too big for it, which you think isn't a problem, except that it allows for other bigger species to get in and perhaps take over the nest. And so Nuthatch has evolved this way of corking up their nest holes with mud, which it sets very hard and prevents larger species moving into it, and therefore restricts it to only birds their size or smaller, which is clever trick if you can get away with it. However, they also like using nest boxes, and this is something I remember well from my days at the lodge. And you get a nest box at the lodge, which was used by Nuthatch, and it still has the instinct to plaster it up with mud, but of course, if it restricted the size of the hole, it wouldn't get in. So it literally plasters up all around it, little cracks and crevices, and builds a sort of builds a porch on the front. And I remember one of the wardens there saying, well, when he got a Nuthatch box to empty out in autumn, that mud has set so hard, he needed hammer and chisel to it was really very solid indeed, which says an awful lot for the power and the use of mud by a really quite small bird. Racing on to long-tailed tit. Another, gosh, I'm going to say my favourite too much, I think, tonight, but this is another one that I really rate very highly. Got a couple of in this series of photographs. This is they were taken in Regent's Park, so we've got a London connection there. London parks are so good for photographing birds. Take your camera down there, and you can often get much closer than you can, even on some of the traditional nature reserves. Looking at the book, we've got a green species again, so no numbers to worry about. Only one brood a year, like a lot of the tits. But it can have 6 to 8 juveniles. That's quite a lot of babies. And perhaps surprisingly for a small bird where the average age is only 2, there have been individuals that have survived for 11 years. I can't resist just saying they're just cute things, aren't they? Just nice birds, long-tailed tits. I think I haven't checked the fact. I think Pirata, it's got the smallest bill of any British species. You can barely see it. Here's a close-up. Pleased with this because you start to get the feel of the colours, which are so difficult to see when you see these birds moving through a woodland, or they move so quickly. They don't stay still to let you have a proper look. So nice to get a picture like this where you can start to see the little bits of sort of salmon pink in the plumage, and it's quite difficult to draw a long-tailed tit where they're grey, where they're brown, where they're salmon pink, and where they're white. And you start to see them disappear into the habitat with this picture because they're really blending into the background, and they spend a lot of their time in this sort of cover. A tangled hedgerow, thick hedgerow edges, woodland edges rather. And worth mentioning here, I think so important, is the call. I haven't got a recording of this because you probably know it, but it's quite difficult to get it loud enough on the machine properly. It's a little buzzing trill and a high pitch, very high, some people can't even really hear it properly, a high frequency. And that combination of the buzz and the trill and the call, so important because it's keeping the flocks together. Communication is everything for these birds. They're living in a dense habitat. They're using those big eyes to look for food. They're looking intently for food all through the hours of daylight. They haven't got time to keep an eye on where their neighbours are, where the rest of the flock has got to. but they can hear it. It's the hearing of that flock that helps to keep them together. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. They're relatively new. Alison mentioned Big Garden Birdwatch, which I sort of started off in 1978. And in those years, in that year, we didn't have really any long-tailed tits to speak of in the record. I didn't even count the numbers that have been seen in gardens. Now it's, I think it's the 8th most common garden bird. This is my garden, and I don't often get them on the bird table. This particular day, my wife had put out crushed porridge oats, and they love them. So there may be a tip there. But most of the time, if I get long-tailed tits in my garden, they're going for the fat balls. But they will come in regularly for this sort of food. And one story which highlights this flocking is going back a few years now, when we had some cold weather just after Christmas, and a flock of 13 long-tailed tits descended on my feeders. And it was quite late at night and they disappeared, but they were there again the next morning, and then again in the evening, and then they went, and the next day were there in the morning. And literally from the end of January right through to March, they were coming morning and evening, making me think they were roosting not very far away. But that was one point, the roost wasn't far away. But the other thing was there were still 13 in March, that all 13 birds, and we have to assume they were the same 13, had managed to keep together through those winter months, not only survive, but hadn't lost each other. And I think that's just quite remarkable. And as for the roosting, well, one thing I want to do, and I've never yet found it, is find a long-tailed tit's roost. So I've had to borrow this photograph. I would love to see this, but this, of course, is what they do when they huddle together at night. And there are all sorts of endearing pictures, and just dig around in the books or on the internet. Lots of people have photographed it. I've not been lucky enough to find one yet. Quick word about nesting, because the nests are very hard to see. They build a nest of lichen and moss, which is tied together with, or joined together with, spider's webs, gossamer. Otherwise, the thing would fall apart. And this thing is a bit like a purse. It moves, it's subtle, but it doesn't really ever break up. And remember that is strong enough to hold 6 to 8 young long-tailed tits plus adults. It says an awful lot for their ability to build nests. To build something of that stature and that capability. Quick word on food. Well, conservation first. The numbers are doing well. There's a graph from the BTO, and if anything, the numbers are going well up since the early 1960s. They're up and down, of course, as all populations are. But this is interesting. This is the date of the first eggs being laid, according to the BTO, way back in the 60s. They're around about the 20th of April. These days, they're around about the 4th of April. So they're about 2 weeks earlier in laying their first broods. And here we are, we're linking up with climate change. A few cultural old names which link into the look of the bird and its nest. Some of the descriptive: a long-tailed muffin, I love that name, long-tailed chittering, a ragamuffin, but also, and some of these might be a bit rude, a bum towel, a nimble tailor, and a prinpiddle, priddle, I think. And these definitely relate to the nests. Hedge jug, poke pudding, feather poke, oven nest, bum barrel, bush oven, bottle tit, or jack in a bottle. So these are old names going back that have been found in different parts of Britain relating to long-tailed tits. Anyway, we must move on and get you to your break in 5 minutes or so with red kite. And now a green species in my books of 20 years old. They started by being red, then went to amber, and now they're green. Thought to be 4,400 plus pairs in Britain at the moment, and that's probably an underestimate. And maximum age recorded so far, about 25 years. We've become familiar with this as an image. Once it was so rare, and we'll move to that in a minute. This is a 14th century, 1400s, 15th century illustration actually of Paris, but could just as well be London, because in medieval Europe, red kites were common scavengers on the streets of cities. And these birds, strange as they look, definitely have hooked bills and forked tails. There's little doubt that they're meant to be kites. We know a little bit about the red kite history. In 1500, thereabouts, diplomatic visitors from Europe commented how tame the kites were in London. But after that, we know the numbers declined. And we can start to pinpoint why in 1566, an act for the preservation of grain, interesting spellings, but never mind, introduced payments for killing vermin. And unfortunately, red kite, like all the birds of prey, counted as vermin. And just one more fact, there's loads more here, but I just picked this one, just it's so indicative. In Tenterden in Kent, 380 kites were killed. I mean, Tenterden, Kent is not a big place. Killed between 1676 and 1685, just over 9 years. 380 kites killed because of this act of Parliament permitting or encouraging people to kill vermin. So that may well have been the beginning of the end for red kite in much of lowland Britain. Very bad map, this. It's an official map, actually, from BirdLife International. Anyway, never mind, don't blame them. 1990 distribution of red kites in Europe, very piecemeal, very patchy, much commoner in the east. And if you look very hard, it's not very easy to see, in central Wales, there is one red dot. This is 1990. People have been worried about red kites from the whole of the 20th century. 1903, a red kite committee was formed in Wales. In 1930 to 60, only 30 birds remained and they could all trace their origin back to one female in Wales, not a healthy situation. There was low productivity, birds were breeding, there were poor habitats, they were becoming a regular target for egg collectors and bounty hunters. Unfortunately, red kites were and still are easy to shoot and poison. And its feeding habits made it vulnerable to organochlorine pesticides, which then further reduced its breeding success. So really it was a downward spiral for red kite. And then 1989 to 94, birds were brought from the continent, various sources, first released in the Chilterns and Scotland, and then subsequent releases in lots of places, actually, but these are just some: Nottinghamshire, Yorkshire, Tyne and Wear, and Ireland. And here were some historic pictures, which are now historic pictures of those releases going on. And red kites were start to be seen again in the Chiltern. But, well, no, I was going to say Chiltern, but all of them, all the populations seemed to do remarkably well. There was a lot of persecution. A lot were found poisoned. Scary number of found poisoned, considering how the chances of finding a poisoned red kite are quite small, unless it's got a radio tag on it. And yet, surprisingly large numbers were being found. Nevertheless, birds became more common and overcame that. And we now know a little bit more about red kites. Well, I suppose we always knew they were scavengers, taking some living prey. It's interesting that in spite of this new population in Britain, they're still very resident in Britain, not moving around too much, where in Europe, some of the populations are migratory. We always used to get occasional red kites come across the North Sea from Europe. They do form winter roosts, and some of those can be quite large, and they do that now here in Britain. So we do get winter roosts of kites, which are quite spectacular, but they tend to choose traditional sites. So once the kite is nested, they may well carry on nesting there year after year. Couple of cultural links just before we finish on this half. I think we're doing quite well for time. Winter's Tale, Shakespeare knew his red kites. He wrote, when the kite builds, look to your lesser linen. Now, you actually have to know quite a lot about kites to know what that reference is, but it's quite amusing if you may have worked it out. Kites were so common in Tudor England, and particularly in built-up areas, And they did, and still do sometimes, take very strange things from their nest material. And they had this reputation of taking small items of clothing off washing lines, hang out across the streets. So this idea of looking to your lesser linen is watch out, the kites will be after your knickers or something like that. Anyway, I think it's interesting. It's a sort of cultural link. It's when you come across it, it's a real gem. Red Kite is an allegorical painting by an English artist called Francis Barlow. Painting and the date, for those historians amongst you, 1655 to 58, just before the restoration of the monarchy, end of the Cromwellian period. And this very large painting is painted in the Dutch style. I know it's Dutch style because they include bittens. All these Dutch paintings of water always have bittens in them, even though this is an English artist and they're meant to be English countryside. It's a very good, I don't know how much you can see on your screens, the birds are actually remarkably good for the date. And it's got all sorts of things that are recognisable. It's got moorhens, it's got mallards, it's got drumming snipe, it's grey heron, mallard, of course. There's also a female goldeneye, which is quite interesting. And in the top, lapwings displaying very acrobatically and very accurately. And then in the top right-hand corner is a red kite. And it's causing havoc amongst the mallard. No, I'm not sure if you're getting that. I'm getting a message, get rid of that. And it's chasing a mallard. Now, or lots of mallards. The mallards are panicking. Now, this is a political painting. It's an allegorical painting. It's not what it looks like. If you had this painting on your wall, you would be making I'm tempted to say a political statement. Perhaps it was political at that time, certainly a religious statement, because the red kite is meant to represent the Catholic Church in England. And what it is doing, it's causing disturbance in the English countryside. So remember the political situation, you're changing from Cromwellian in England to the new restoration of the new monarchy, which was so heavily suspected to be Catholic. And here you are saying a red bird in the countryside is going to cause chaos. So you are actually, if you have this on your wall and you're calling your neighbours to see this, the local gentry, you are probably making a statement about where your beliefs might be. So we've got 3 species to go, but I've rolled 2 of them together, Redwing and Fieldfare, because at this time of year, they're almost synonymous. People talk about, have you seen any Redwings and Fieldfares? And it's so easy to sort of talk of them as one in a way. But of course, they are quite different creatures in different habitats. So it's worth just exploring a little bit. So we're talking about Fieldfares and Redwings. Going back to look at the book, because they both breed in Britain occasionally. They're down as red data species. So they're red, and in the case of Fieldfare, in the case of Fieldfare, it might only be a pair a year. Sometimes a few more, but they're tiny. They're real rare. It's almost a mistake when they breed. Just to look at the longevity, we've been doing with other species. Oldest recorded, though the average age may only be 2, there are records of at least one bird reaching 18, which seems surprising. Although these bigger thrushes, we know blackbirds can go on to 20 plus, or odd ones can anyway. So that isn't a total surprise. Redwing also red data. Yes, a few more breeding. Interesting to see if this carries on. It did look at one time as if they were going to colonise parts of Scotland. Speyside had quite a few breeding. Certainly last time I was up there, but it's a few years ago now, I found a few in breeding in spring. 24 is sort of an average number of pairs. It is tiny. Let's put the arrows up, and again, quite a long-lived bird. Considering most of them are migrants, 17 years is still. I think of the miles they would have travelled during those 17 years is really impressive. Quick look at a redwing. I'm sure you really do know what it looks like, but this is just a reminder. Creamy white stripe over the eyebrow. Orangey red flanks, sort of not really under the wing, but below the wing is better description. Very dark streaks on the breast, and it's sort of greyish brown back. It's not chocolate brown. I'll just put up a song thrush for a minute and particularly look at the head of that song thrush and then look at the head of the redwing. And you see really, and again, look at the spots on the song thrush. Although it's a bit streaky, it's not nearly as streaky as redwing. And there's a little bit of orange under the red song thrush wing. It's usually quite hard to see. I was up at Norfolk this weekend and they were redwings coming in off the sea. I saw my first one being caught actually and ringed at Holden next to sea on Sunday morning. So they are, some of them are here already. Fieldfare, a large upright thrush. They can look very upright and untidy in flight. They are, I think, quite characteristic. And the white underwing usually shows. And there's one, and this sort of flash of white shows up really well when they sort of flop along in their flocks. Has a sort of grey hood, a heavily marked breast, dark spots with sort of chestnut behind them. And the frosty chestnut back. We'll come back to this frostiness in a minute. That's a phrase that a number of bird books now use. I think it's quite a good description. Very different from the sort of stone grey of a mistle thrush. Couldn't really, you shouldn't really confuse those too much if you see them properly. Distribution, summer migrant to much of northern Scandinavia, northern Europe, right into Russia and even into Asia. Winter visitor to most of Europe. That's fieldfare. Redwing is very much the same, but the thing to notice is summer includes Iceland. And those Iceland birds have to come out and have to go south. In fact, they come southeast, and they arrive in Britain. And so we get a large number, or at least Ireland does, if not mainland Britain, gets a large number of Icelandic redwings. However, I've been up north and seen both on their breeding grounds. This is in Norway. This is a fieldfare, and feeding on worms. So they take over from our thrushes. And there it is, feeding on worms, and it's even feeding worms to its youngster, who doesn't seem best pleased with this very large worm it was given. This was in Trondheim Cathedral grounds, where I photographed that. Redwings in Iceland, also feeding on worms and feeding them to their young as well. Very productive, these northern areas in summer. But redwing was interesting. I've got one other photograph, which only when I looked at it afterwards, realised that this one is eating a caterpillar. It's almost certainly a moth caterpillar, and lots of moths in the short summer months of an Icelandic summer, and redwings very much feeding on those. And it's worth stating this, they're feeding on vertebrates, because when they come to Britain for the winter, they're coming for our berries. And it's the berry harvest that is so good for all these winter thrushes. They're our own thrushes, blackbirds and redwings, blackbirds and song thrushes as well, and mistle thrushes. But redwings often on the hawthorn berries as soon as they arrive, and similarly fieldfares going for them as well. Just a few facts about redwings and fieldfares. Redwings are classic night migrants. And you can hear them flying at night, this high-pitched zeep call as they fly over. And I've heard them in London going, if there isn't too much traffic noise, you're somewhere quiet, perhaps very early in the morning, frosty night in October, that would be something this year. But on a frosty night when they're migrating, clear skies and this high-pitched zeep, and so important because that, like the long-tailed tits, is a contact call. It's keeping the flocks together as they move into Britain from over the North Sea or wherever they've come from. Sometimes last year, or 2 years ago, very large numbers of redwings all arrived over just a few days, literally hundreds, thousands. Fieldfares make their way across the country in large, noisy flocks. You do tend to hear fieldfares coming. You don't always hear redwings during the day when there's a bit more noise around. Both start to arrive from the north in early autumn, and this is about the time they're starting to arrive. As I said, just now in Norfolk, the redwings are arriving. Both will often feed close together, so they do have quite a lot in common, and both feed on berries. And then, but this is important, they can both revert to feeding on invertebrates. So because they do in the summer, they feed on invertebrates. When the berries run out, they can go back to feeding on worms. If they can find areas of grass that haven't got covered in snow and hoarfrost, then they're okay. They can carry on. Birds like waxwings, which only feed on berries in winter and don't really feed on invertebrates. They're not conditioned to feed on vertebrates. They've got a long sort of bill for that, at least big chunky ones and things in the soil they can't do. They catch flying invertebrates. They have to keep traveling. They become nomadic. But the other thing is about redwings and fieldfares, they both roost communally at night, not often together. Sometimes they're together in the same roosts. Sometimes they have separate roosts. And both will visit gardens in extreme cold weather. Redwings and fieldfares can both turn up in, I can say, ordinary gardens, suburban gardens. So there's redwing feeding on its berries. Cultural links for fieldfare. Well, I love the one that Chaucer, writing around about 1530, 1350 or just after, in his Parliament of Fowls, he refers to a number of birds. It's worth looking at them, but in one of them he refers to the frosty fieldfare. So that, remember, I described the back as bird books now talk about looking as slightly frosty on the back. Just has these little hints of silver almost at the ends of some of the feathers. Well, Chaucer had hit on this, and what an amazing sort of ornithological observation by our poet. Fieldfare, it's thought, comes from the Anglo-Saxon from feldfare, feld being fields, open spaces, meaning so, and fare meaning to travel. So a traveller over the fields. It's almost what it sounds like, but it's quite nice to get a derivation which seems to go back to Old English or Anglo-Saxon anyway. There's our fieldfare. A few more cultural links to fieldfare and indeed to redwing. John Clare, my favourite sort of wildlife poet. If you don't know him, find out more. Wonderful descriptions. A real ornithologist, really knew his birds intimately. Interestingly, he gets the right spelling for fieldfare. Flocking fieldfares, speckled like the thrush. So he's differentiated between fieldfares and other thrushes. Picking the red haws from the swaying bush. I think swaying means swaying. That's the sense there. He writes very phonetically, but is charming in the process. So John Clare, recognising fieldfares for what they were, in flocks in winter, picking the red haws. It's all right, it's absolutely spot on. This is no airy fairy romantic poet. This is a man of the fields. Matthew Arnold, hollies with scarlet berries gemmed, the fieldfare's food. So he's gone back to the old spelling there, interestingly. And so does Wordsworth. Wordsworth refers to fieldfares, but then he lived amongst the fells. So perhaps there was a good reason for that. Just a few with redwing. It's not as clear cut. Redwing doesn't have, but a few regional names. I do like Frolly for a regional name for redwing. Swinepipe, I don't know how that comes about. Sometimes you can work it out, sometimes you can't. But also windle or windle thrush or wind thrush. And I'm not sure what windle is, but perhaps it expresses a bird coming in on the wind. I don't know. It's perhaps slightly poetic. I like that. So we'll finish. There's our redwing. And we'll move on to our last species, which I have to confess, I don't really know where in London to go and find kingfishers. This is what I was saying to Alison. If you're looking to me to say, oh, go down so-and-so, I have no idea. Last time I had good views of them was in the Lee Valley and at Rye Meads, of course. And they had Kingfisher Hide. Well, they had Kingfisher Hide and the observation areas there. We used to get them in Windsor Great Park. I don't know if you still do. Anyway, a few photographs. They're all my own, so they're not very good. There's a random mix of kingfishers here, good, bad, and indifferent. Looking at them here, amber, a little bit worried, but not over worried. Interestingly here, 1 to 3 broods a year. Now, let's dwell on that for a moment. Kingfisher has a real problem. Hard winters is one problem. Ice and snow and frozen rivers can't feed problem. The other problem they have is changing water levels. Wet summers, they nest in holes in riverbanks, and nest holes get regularly flooded. It's one of the things that happens if you nest in a riverbank. It's likely to get submerged in a wet summer. So kingfishers failing it's not uncommon. So it's not also, they are sort of programmed to have up to 3 broods a year. So there is a sort of an extra brood or 2 in the bank should there be a catastrophic failure. And they can have between 5 and 7 young at a time. So providing the food is there, and this ties in with pollution, of course, and health of the rivers and all, there's a huge, big subject all around this. But providing nature takes its course, they can recover quite quickly from dire consequences of a cold winter or rapidly changing water levels. And again, the oldest there, I find this quite surprising. I think it was a continental one. There is a record of a 21-year-old kingfisher, which I find quite remarkable. Colour. Are they green or are they blue? Well, of course, it's a trick of the light. You're looking at a rainbow. You're looking at brown feathers, really, and you're looking at the way that light refracts off feathers, which is tricking your eye into thinking they're blue or green or shades of in between. So the whole thing, and I'm always interested to see what artists do with kingfisher feathers. You think they're brightly coloured and you couldn't miss them. And here's a kingfisher in a tree, and yes, of course you can see it. But actually, it's surprising how it, disappears in amongst the foliage. And if there'd been a few russet leaves in there in autumn, you might have missed it altogether. This is Falmere, RSPB Reserve, bought by the old YOC, Junior RSPB. Voice. Now, I'm not sure you'll hear this, but I'll just try it. But I'll explain what's happening. So here's kingfisher recording. Once more, perhaps. Yeah. A high-pitched squeak over bubbling water. It's very quiet. It gets a bit louder in a minute. I'm not sure you can hear that, but the point is that, like lots of waterside birds, they have high frequency calls. And there is good reason for that. It's because the ambient sound of water and watery habitat is quite low and vibrant and at a low frequency, and therefore their calls need to be at a higher frequency to get over the ambient sound around them. And so kingfishers are a very good example of having this high-pitched call to overcome that. But when you think about it, most of our watery species, waterside species traditionally, also have high-pitched calls or songs. Dipper, not an easy bird to go out and hear or see, particularly in southeast England, but they're very high-pitched. Wagtails, pretty high-pitched as well. Common sandpiper up in the uplands again. So this is not a one-off. This is I think relatively commonplace to watery species. Distribution. Not sure that map shows a lot really. It's what it shows. It's well spread out through the whole of England. Gets scarce as you get into Scotland. Really none north of the central belt of Scotland. Of course, once you get up in the Highlands, and pretty scattered widely in Ireland. Not very densely populated anywhere. Distribution worldwide is surprisingly wide. And quite a lot of those are northerly and running into Central Europe and into Russia and into Asia. And a lot of those northerly populations are migratory. I think I've only been on Rhodes Island in the Mediterranean twice, where kingfishers shouldn't be found, on both times seen kingfishers in Rhodes Island, Rhodes Harbour, simply because they're migrants. They've come down for the winter. They wouldn't breed there. They've come probably from Germany or Poland or somewhere like that, and they'll return. So there is a lot of movement of kingfishers around simply because they can't tolerate the cold Central European winters. We see a little bit of that. I thought we didn't see anything, and I looked on the BTO website, and it's always worth seeing what BTO is putting up, and you have to dig around for the information. It's not always easy to find, but there's some good stuff there. And it showed a few positions in Europe where kingfishers they'd either been ringed in those places in Europe and turned up in Britain at some time, or vice versa. The ones in Britain had been found in those places. I'm not sure, probably a combination of both. And it's not masses, it's nothing like the starlings or anything like that. But you can see there is some sort of movement of a few birds between into the near continent, and some going further east, perhaps towards Germany. Habits. They like habitats rather. They like lakes, slow flowing rivers and large streams, of course. Garden ponds they will come into. I don't think people mind kingfishers in their garden ponds. They don't like herons for some reason, but they don't mind kingfishers. Estuaries, especially in winter, some estuaries will have herons. Kingfishers arrive because they've been perhaps in the cold winter frozen out upstream, and so this is a typical summer habitat of kingfisher. Diet is fish, yes, of course, and it's particularly bullhead, loach, minnow, stickleback, small chub, but also insect, not specifically, not only fish, not exclusively fish. So it also eats things like mayflies, stoneflies, dragonfly nymphs, and water beetles. And you suspect it probably can't tell the difference much when it catches one underwater, and they're good to eat. Just a few separate sort of facts here. Mainly monogamous for some reason, except in Sweden, where perhaps they're more migratory, I don't know. They pair up in autumn. They retain separate territories during the winter. Territory may be a kilometre of riverbank, so quite a long way. They can disappear a long way upstream when they fly off and you don't find them again. Nest in a hole in a riverbank, maybe some way from water. They don't have to be on the edge of the water. They're probably safer if they're not. And they excavate a tunnel. It's almost from sort of 0.5 metre up to 1 metre long, which is quite an amazing thing to dig into an earth bank when you think they're not that well equipped for doing it, although they do have a pretty sharp beak and pretty sharp little claws. Male will courtship feed the female. That's been well photographed. And the nest is often amongst old fish bones and droppings, and it becomes filthy. This comes from the standard books, and there's much bathing. So this isn't me. This is me quoting experts on this subject. Just to see what's going on. Well, there's been some ups and downs. I suspect with water quality at the moment that we're on a downward track. BTO haven't put up any recent maps, recent graphs. I would love to see this one carried on for another 3 years, just to see where we've got to. Cultural links. A dead kingfisher is said to ward off lightning. Well, okay, we won't go too much into that. Don't think we want to see then too many people waving around dead kingfishers in the hope they don't get struck by lightning. And the mythical name Halcyon refers to kingfishers. You may have known that, but I thought it was worth putting up. One myth is for 7 days before and after the winter solstice, the Halcyon broods her eggs on an ocean in a nest, on the ocean in a nest made of fish bones. It's interesting in these old folky things that I'm going to say it's rubbish. Yes, but you get these sort of scientific facts. The fishbone bit is right. You know, the in amongst the make-believe is stuff that is correct science. And this is how we get the term halcyon days. And much art. And just 2 bits of art to finish with, because I know we've run out of time. Alison will be chasing me. This was a little discovery. I was pleased with this. My son's an artist, and we were working together collaboratively on an exhibition that involved birds in Leeds Art Gallery and Museum. And the curator said they had some artwork which hardly ever saw the light of day, and they'd like to include it in the exhibition. So we said, well, let's see. Yeah, okay, dead kingfisher. Okay, dead kingfisher. But what was interesting, it's a dead kingfisher by J.M.W. Turner. It's a Turner kingfisher. Who knew Turner painted birds? And there were some other ones as well. We had a little exhibition of Turner's birds. But he's captured the colour brilliantly. And one last story, and then I really am finishing. I'm never sure how to pronounce that, Albin, illustrated one of the first bird books. 1694 to 1730, he lived, 1790. It was the early 1720s, the book was published, 1730s, and it covered a good selection of British birds. He took the credit for all the artwork, although most of it was done by his daughter. So that was the trouble with female artists, they didn't get the credits. However, this book found its way into Europe and was very popular. And people studying mice and pottery, especially a set of birds, a magnificent set of birds made for the Elector of Saxony, which is a priceless collection. Only very few complete sets exist. I have seen the sets in New York. A lot of the images actually come from Albin's book. And I think this Kingfisher is one of them. I've reversed it round, and the pied wagtail I know in this set is definitely a British pied wagtail. So we've got this early English artwork book. Here we've got Kingfisher appearing on mice and pottery in a priceless set for the Elector of Saxony. So we'll finish there with a nice-ish picture of a kingfisher. I just think of halcyon days when kingfishers were perhaps a little bit more common than they are now. And I better stop there.